Thank you so much. Well, thank you all very much. It is a pleasure to be here today and to address you. And there are a few things I want to talk about in my remarks that I hope will hit home. I know there's been a lot of volatility and questions, both about the short term for oil and gas and the global economy, and I'll talk about that, as well as long-term trends. And so my talk today is titled, The Future of Energy in a Time of Uncertainty. And the way I break things out really is headlines and trend lines. The headlines right now really are around what's going on in the global economy. So I know the big question is what's going to happen with global growth. But let's talk first about some upside risks to the global economy that have implications for oil and gas. And then let's talk about the downside risks. On the upside, the most important thing as we think about globally is the U.S., the summer driving season is the biggest seasonal source of oil demand in the world. And this summer driving season is likely to be record-breaking. Let me tell you why. Right now, the U.S. labor force is bigger than it's ever been as we sit here today, 166.7 million people in the labor force. Only about 1.1% of those people are collecting unemployment, 1.1%. Now, the official unemployment rate is 3.5. But based on the number of people who are collecting unemployment, 1.1%. Wages have never been this high. They've gone up over $4.50 in the last 3 years. And that's 70% of U.S. GDP is people buying stuff. And there's over 9.9 million open jobs in the U.S. right now. Just to recap, 70% of U.S. GDP comes from people buying stuff, including fuel. They have more jobs than they've ever had. And we have 9.9 million open jobs even now. Now, it's down from 12, but before the Great Recession, there were only 4.5 million open jobs in the U.S. There's 9.9 now. Before the 2001 recession, there were 5 million open jobs. Again, there's 9.9 now. So that looks pretty good. Fed policy rates, sending interest rates higher because the Fed's not worried about jobs. Fed has two jobs, really two things to focus on, their dual mandate. Keeping full employment and keeping prices low and stable. If there's 9.9 million open jobs with the biggest labor force in history and only 1.1% of those people are collecting unemployment, we're at full employment. So the focus really is on inflation, not just for the Fed, but other central banks around the world. But they're almost done raising interest rates, and I'll talk more about this. Peak consumer inflation is likely behind us, although there are some concerns that it might be plateauing out, and core inflation is a risk. And I know these higher interest rates we've seen are particularly nefarious for emerging markets, which I'll talk about in a second. Scavenger hunt economics has been easing in the United States and globally. And by scavenger hunt economics, I mean, and I know, because y'all work with rigs and drilling, you know what I'm talking about. You've got to find people. It's tough to find the people. Good, you've got the people. Do you have your components? Oh no, now we got to get the components we need. All right, finally we've got the components. Do you have the equipment? We've got the equipment, but now we need more people. And you go around and around and around. And for the last 3 years, that's felt like a really rough merry-go-round where you're trying to get everything in order just to do the projects you have in front of you, and you're struggling to manage it and get all the people and equipment and components and everything at once. But that's easing up globally. And in the U.S., again, thinking about that summer driving season, consumer debt delinquencies are at a record low. Out of all the consumer debt in the U.S., which is around $17 trillion, only 2.5% of that is delinquent. It's never been that low. In 2009, 2010, it was 12%, almost. Now it's 2.5. So I'm optimistic, especially about the summer driving season, and that even if we get a contraction in the U.S. GDP-wise, it will probably be in the categories of investment, driven by housing, and we might see one for earnings, because OPEX is up. Right? We think about those higher wages. CapEx costs are up. Think about the higher interest rates. So you could have an earnings recession. But with 9.9 million jobs, I'm not worried about a deep recession in the U.S. right now. The downside risks are that global growth is slowing, but it's not expected to slow to a deep recession. I'll talk about that in a second. There's still monetary policy tightening ahead, not just for the Fed, but other central banks globally. Year-on-year inflation is expected to remain elevated in the short term. My biggest concern, the thing that keeps me up at night, the thing that we've actually trademarked, is Cold War II. That's what we're worried about. We think that's unlikely to end soon. And banking risks are elevated, but we think that for the moment, that's not the biggest risk on the table. For the global outlook, IMF released their growth forecasts just about a week ago. Global GDP down from 5 to 6% growth in 2021, which is great, 3.4 last year. It's a good year. This year's expected to be 2.8, next year's expected to be 3%. Advanced economies feeling the brunt of the slowdown, going from 2.7% GDP growth last year to 1.3 this year, expected to go up to 1.4 next year. Stronger in emerging economies, 4.0 last year, 3.9 this year, 4.2 next year. And if we look at low-income developing economies, last year 5%, this year 4.7, next year 5.4. None of this is catastrophic. It is slower. To give you some idea, global GDP based just on population growth should get you to around 3%. So last year, great year. This year, a little bit below that. Next year, right on top of that's the expectation. There are some downside risks later in the year, especially what we might see in earnings reports for Q2 and Q3. The bigger risk right now on the global stage, the IMF report out last week, inflation's slowing and it's at risk of plateauing. That's the thing. On the left, you see headline CPI, US, Eurozone, median, right across advanced economies. You can see on the left, it's lower than it was. In the US, for example, right, CPI right now at 5% was 9.1. So 5% is definitely an improvement, but it's still kind of high. Right, Fed's target's 2. On the right, you see core CPI looks like it's kind of flattened out, hasn't gone down as much. Most recent month, the U.S. went up 5.6 from 5.5, which means core CPI, which excludes food and energy, is now above the headline number. That's a bit of a concern. And that's not just a concern in the U.S. or the Eurozone, that's a concern across economies. What happens if inflation gets stuck at these levels? Good news is the inflation expectations globally pretty unchanged for now. Let me tell you what we're looking at. Advanced economies, emerging markets, low-income developing countries. The blue represents what the pre-pandemic survey was of where do you think inflation rates will be 5 years in the future. The red is a January 2023 survey. 5 years in the future, what does inflation look like? Advanced economies anchored pretty closely to 2%. That's good. Emerging markets, it's lower. There's a lower expectation of inflation 5 years out than there was before COVID. Same thing's true for low-income developing countries. Down from like 5.5% to 5% is the 5-year out expectation for inflation. So this is a global set of expectations around inflation coming out of a high inflation environment, and there's still an expectation that global central bank coordination to raise interest rates will indeed keep inflation. That's all, will kill inflation. That is the good news, right? Unchanged expectations, actually improved for emerging and low-income developing countries for now. So that's the short term. There are some risks. The higher interest rates pose some challenges, which I'll talk about in a second. Some of that folds into the Cold War II risks. But as I think about the big, longer-term trend lines for oil and gas, I don't want to bury the lead. Let's talk about the number one thing we need to be thinking about, which is global demographics. We fast forward between 2020 and 2050, there's going to be about 1.8 million more people, 1.8 billion more people on planet Earth, right? That's a lot of people. I don't have kids, but I hear in the delivery room they don't show up with all the hydrocarbons they're going to need in their lifetime. There's already 750 million people living in energy poverty right now, around 1.5 billion who do not have clean cooking fuels, and we're going to add 1.85 billion people on planet Earth in the next 30 years. This is the fundamental reality. We look, where are they being added? Really, it's very heavily least developed countries. You're adding 850 million people. So this is it. This is the whole, honestly, I probably could put up the whole slide. You want to know the future of oil and gas? I know there's folks who say, well, we're not going to need it. It's going to be gone tomorrow. No more. This is it. Higher population, higher global wealth, and already a high number of people living in energy poverty. The demand for oil and gas is going to continue to rise. That doesn't mean that sustainability initiatives will stop. These are increasing and accelerating. In fact, this year, most companies have yet to kind of realize this, but in the US, the SEC will require large public companies to report their sustainability metrics, their Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions, climate risk stuff. They're expected to report that for their 2023 fiscal year. That means when they do their filings next year for this fiscal year, they've got to have all that information in there. That pressure is real. Regulatory, government, institutional investor pressure is not going away. And the story of getting to net zero emissions in 2050 is not going away either. The catch is that it doesn't look like we're probably going to get to those numbers. The IMF released these data from October 2022, and if we look at where the climate change commitments are right now, it's expected to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 11% by 2030. But if you look at where the real decreases expected are, they'd be a lot lower. And there's even a chance that in some areas emissions are going to go up. That's what the forecasts are telling us. We look at CO2 energy-related forecasts out of the U.S. Energy Administration. By the way, this data came out just a few weeks ago. This is from the current administration. And it shows where we're expected to see CO2 emissions go, million metric tons. You see where we are at 2022. It's expected to fall further by 2030, but then kind of flattened out. That dark black line, that's the reference case. Yeah, there's a high economic case, in which case it never goes down, and a low economic case in which you could go down a bit further. But generally speaking, there's likely to be some further decrease and a flattening out. That's the current administration's current forecast. Part of the reason that we might see some hesitance to accelerate things in the short term, and we might need to wait a little while to figure out what the winners are going to be in the energy transition. In other words, the 2020s really are the decade that's a transition to a transition. Has a lot to do with what's going on in Cold War II and the energy trilemma. So if we think back, February 4th, 2022, the announcement of the Olympics, that China and Russia strongly defend the outcomes of the Second World War. Seems like an odd thing to say in 2022, maybe more relevant in like 1945, whatever. They strongly defend the outcomes of the Second World War, and there's no limit to their cooperation. Shortly after that, right, the Russian war on Ukraine. The way I think of that is a wedding, not like a happy June wedding sort of thing, more like a Game of Thrones wedding, which is why we end up with a push towards this map, right? 1945 level of control that Russia had, thinking about China and Taiwan being one entity. That's the future that Russia and China want to go back to. And I know this has had a significant and deleterious impact on your company and your colleagues, and I'm sorry to hear that. It's also something that's probably not likely to stop anytime soon. Map of Russia. Every day, the Institute for the Study of War out of the U.S. releases maps that show what area Russia controls, these 4 eastern sections. Most of those chunks have also been annexed. and the blue sections which Ukraine has taken back. Probably the biggest challenge around this is thinking, well, how is this going to play out? We see this being very much like Korea, something that started Cold War I, where this could last for many years or decades, and that you have an unstoppable force and an immovable object. Fortunately, for now, we've got agricultural commodities that are now freely moving, although that's up for renegotiation in May. But this has had huge negative impacts across commodity markets, global economy, and of course on the people in the region. But it's not likely to end soon. A lot of this really is an extension of the weaponization of Russia's greatest weapon, which is the winter. If we think about historical data, right? I mean, the Russians used the winter to beat Napoleon. They used it to beat the Nazis. And they've tried to use it, in this case, to really wedge discord among European countries that are trying to oppose the Russian war in Ukraine. A lot of this is tied to what folks had built around the green energy revolution in Europe, bought, and sold with cheap Russian gas. There's a map of Europe showing Russian gas dependence in 2020 as a percent of energy consumption, right? Hungary, 50%-ish, most of Central Europe, right? 30%-ish plus. They were hooked on the sauce. And so hearing this on the U.S. side of the pond, you need to be greener, you need to be greener, you need to be greener, all of that was bought with Russian gas. And now we see the energy trilemma revealed, where previously there was a dilemma, how do we have energy that's affordable and sustainable? We now realize there's now a security component to that. Because you want the energy to be as affordable as possible, you want it to be as clean as possible, but you also want it to be there when you need it. You want to turn on the lights and know there's going to be power. You want to turn on your car and know there's fuel. Right? Those kinds of things are fundamental. The cut in terms of supplies into Europe have been massive. Millions of cubic meters a day, going from around 450 million down to around 75 last year. Huge drop-off in all the gas coming from Russia. As a replacement, Europe bought a lot of very expensive liquefied natural gas out of the U.S. And even the Germans have turned back on coal production in order to bridge some of the gap for power. Because at some point, right, there's a German phrase, erst kommt das Fressen, dann kommt die Moral, right? First comes the feeding, then come the morals. Push come to shove, you want your energy to be secure first and foremost. And obviously, with that decline in supply, right, so stack bar chart falling, you see the black line, that's falling. The red and the blue here are prices. You can see the red is the Dutch natural gas price going from $5 in Jan 2021 to around $100 last summer, falling last fall down to around 50, 60 bucks. It's a huge increase in price. Reveals how important the security part is. And of course, this isn't lost on other parts of the world, right? So I'm from Texas. If Texas were its own country, we would have more wind power generation than any country in the world. We're looking to have a lot more wind and a lot more solar. You know what we're also planning? A lot more combined cycle gas turbines. Why? Because the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, but you always want power to be there when you need it. Building more peakers. Have to have them. That's just the reality. Now you might ask the question, like, who knew? Like, did people know that this was going to be that big an issue in Europe, right? For 25 years, the Russians have been exporting this gas. Everybody knew, nobody could talk about it. Let me tell you a story. So in early 2008, I'm working on a consulting project, a German-Russian joint venture. It's a nat gas JV. bringing in gas from Russia, distributing it in Germany and the rest of Europe. I was a risk specialist. My job was to analyze the risk books. So any of you who hedge any of the expenses, maybe the steel for some of your equipment, currencies that you might be using in different areas, my job was to look at those risks for nat gas. Look at the trading positions, look at the contracts. Contracts, super secret, 20 to 30-year contracts with different kinds of pricing, varied by commodity. Very complicated, super secret stuff. My job was to go through all these. Working language of the project was German. Project was in Germany. My first master's was in German. But one day, one of the senior partners comes to visit, pulls me aside, says to me in English, make sure I get it. He says, Jason, don't ask too many questions. I said, what do you mean? Like, I got to look at the books, and we got to match up these numbers, and this thing goes, we don't want to find your body in a dumpster. So, like a couple weeks later, I had transferred myself, was on a project in Chicago. I'm gone. Now, I told that story not too long ago, and someone in the back goes, we got dumpsters in Chicago too. I said, but they weren't meant for me. So people knew this was a risk, and you really couldn't talk about it. And that's just one piece of what Cold War II has done. The other part's the electrification risk. Let's talk about this. A lot of folks think we're going to get to net zero with batteries alone. And I feel like I have to tell groups who believe this that they are not cold fusion batteries. You have to plug them in somewhere, and they get power from somewhere else. And the big issue with the batteries is we're not mining enough stuff to make all the batteries everyone is planning on. Let me tell you what we're looking at. This is data from the IMF last December, and it shows the supply-demand ratio for a number of different commodities. 1 means the supply-demand ratio of what we're currently mining is enough to get us to net zero. The only material that's at a 1 is lead. Copper, we're currently mining 60% of the copper we'd need to get to net zero. We're also only mining 35% of the nickel, 20% of the cobalt, and 15% of the graphite we need to get to net zero by 2050 with the electrification numbers that are out there. In other words, batteries are not the answer. To wit, and how it ties in with Cold War II, where do some of these battery materials come from, you may ask? And some of you may be well versed. We look at the list. Many of them come from, you guessed it, China and Russia. So all these dreams of electrified cars, there could be an issue here, and it could be a significant one. Of course, we haven't even talked about the fact that then you're going to need a lot more power gen in the grid with a lot more people plugging in their cars. But ignoring that fact, let's assume we get there, lots of renewables, more combined cycle gas turbines, all that stuff. The supply chain for the batteries is a problem. This is the reason Tesla's building their mega battery factory right now in China, right? They moved a lot of their stuff to Texas, but they have to do the battery stuff in China because that's where the materials are. That could be an issue. And if I think about U.S.-China relations, there's a problem right now. It's a pretty big one. This is recent survey data out in the last 2 weeks from Pew Research. Partnership between China and Russia, 62% of Americans say it's a very serious problem. The situation in tension, China and Taiwan, 47% of Americans say it's a very serious problem. We look at U.S. opinion of China, 83% of Americans, 83%. Pew is a very reputable organization, does this research. 83% of Americans have an unfavorable view of China right now. Only 14% have a favorable view. We look back just 5-6 years ago, and it's 50-50. Maybe you've heard in the U.S. that there's significant political polarization, and you can see it on the news, the Democrats, the Republicans, and the whole thing. There's one thing they agree on right now, China. In the U.S., we have this thing called the Business Roundtable. It's a group of 100 CEOs who advise elected leaders of both parties. It's a nonpartisan organization. In 27 states, there are 100 CEOs who do the same thing. They advise elected leaders at the state level and the federal level. In Texas, I'm one of those 100 CEOs. And every year we fly up to D.C., we meet with congressmen of both parties, one or two of our senators, and the administration, whichever party it is. Met with the Trump administration, met with the Biden administration. The daylight between them on China could not be seen. There was no difference. The push on this is going to get more extreme. It's the only bipartisan issue out there right now, and people are very concerned about it. Companies are moving jobs back for manufacturing to the U.S. Dual-use technologies are coming under more scrutiny. You're going to have increased supply chain challenges there. This is going to get worse. In an Atlantic Council survey just from a few months ago, over 70% of respondents expect that China will attempt to take Taiwan by force in the next decade. Now, I don't necessarily think it will come by force the way the Russian war on Ukraine has happened. I think more like blockade, thinking back to what happened to Berlin in the first Cold War. Taiwan's a lot bigger than Berlin. Maybe they won't turn away U.S. naval vessels. They'll probably turn away a bunch more. Why would they do that? They want the semiconductor industry. 90% of the highest value semiconductors in the world are made in Taiwan. China wants Taiwan to be part of China, and they want the semiconductor industry intact. You don't want a situation like in Ukraine, right? The Russians don't care if it's a mountain of rubble. They did it in Grozny. They did it in Aleppo. They do not care. China cares a whole lot about what happens with the semiconductor industry. So I think they'll go slow, like they have with other geopolitical pushes in the South China Sea, go so slow that it doesn't warrant a big reaction. But the U.S. is, that relationship with China is very tense right now. It's going to make countries have to choose, I think, at some point, which supply chain they serve. For dual-use technologies. For commodities, I'm less concerned. We look back to Cold War I, right? Why is OPEC headquartered in Vienna? It's there because Austria was reunified at the end of the first Cold War. Vienna and Austria were partitioned, just like Berlin, just like Germany, and they were reunified. Neutral. It's because the oil had to flow everywhere. And I think commodities are less exposed. Like if this was a room full of people making robotics and AI, making laptops, cell phones, I tell you in the next 5 years you're going to have to choose. Do you want Europe and US to be your market, or do you want China to be your end market? You're not going to be able to serve both. I'm less concerned about commodities. They'll find a way to move around. They always have. For emerging markets, though, I'm a little bit concerned. There's a bit of a debt trap diplomacy issue. This is the debt levels for low-income countries. Let me explain what we're looking at. The bottom blue in the chart is what's called the Paris Club. Think about the IMF, the US, Germany, France, G7 kind of countries. The darker blue swath that goes from not much in 06 to 70% today, that's China. China is the bank for 70% of emerging market debt right now. So we think about Cold War I, think about Cold War II. What financial leverage does the Paris Club have? What financial position does the U.S. have? China has a lot more soft diplomacy, power, and leverage than the U.S. and the Paris Club. And regarding climate change, 52% of Americans in the survey in the last 2 weeks believe that the U.S. and China cannot cooperate on climate change. 54% also say they cannot cooperate on resolving international conflicts. So that doesn't bode well for where we're going in terms of conflict-wise, but from a climate change standpoint, you're going to be looking at a couple of different sets of climate change policies going forward. One of the other things that's been a more recent development as we think about the energy trilemma is what's going on with energy prices, right? These are coal prices. Low for a long time, spiked massively last year like many other commodity prices on the Russian war in Ukraine, and of course on increased demand out of Europe and elsewhere to supplement those lost Russian gas supplies. But even if we look at oil prices, right, WTI, where we are today, People will bemoan how expensive it is, but it's actually not. If we deflate it, so this is the blue line, the actual price of crude oil on a monthly basis. The orange is deflated into $1983. The interesting part is, if we look at where oil prices were even just last month compared to 1983, in 1983, price was $30 a barrel in the spring. Last month, in $1983, it was $25. So oil prices are still relatively cheap. Think about nat gas. Obviously, prices have come down significantly since when price caps put on. They've moved up a little bit in the past month. But if we look going back to 1983, similar story, right? Around $2 in 1983. In 1983, well below $1. So yeah, prices look high. But if we deflate the prices, they're not. So a few things about the automotive outlook. There's likely to be, because of the battery limitations, a bigger push towards industrial and commercial vehicle application for electrification. Short haul. Think about the Amazon vans that drive around neighborhoods and the like, mail trucks. Those will probably be mostly electric in a very short period of time. They have a high utilization rate. But for light-duty personal vehicles, like the cars and trucks y'all drive, the car that I drive, it has like a 3% utilization rate. And I don't drive Herbie the Love Bug. It's not out there doing its thing. It's sitting in a driveway. To be honest, it's a waste of the limited battery materials to have my car be electric because I don't use it much. Perhaps this is part of the reason why the U.S. Energy Information Agency expects and forecasts currently in the reference case that by 2050, less than 20% of light-duty vehicles in the U.S. are expected to be electric. Over 80% are expected to be still conventional fuels. This is data that's a month old from the Biden administration. These are the forecasts of what they're expecting. Looks like we're still going to be using gasoline for a long time. If we look at the actual forecast for the top is liquid fuels, the bottom is nat gas. Demand is expected to ease through the 2030s and then go back up to pretty close to where we are right now. So this is a really interesting situation because folks are talking about moving away from fuels, but if you look at the actual numbers, there's going to be a lot of demand there. And of course, this isn't where the additional incremental demand is coming from. That's all coming from the 1.85 billion additional people on the planet and the other 1.5 billion that currently don't have clean cooking fuels. Renewables are going to see a big increase, though. It's going to be largely on the power generation side, but it's really going to be just replacing coal. These are the data for 2022, and I want to point out a few things. The orange line going all the way up, that's nat gas. The green line that's gone up quite a bit and did surpass coal last year for the first time, that's renewables. But that move higher in tandem for natty as well as renewables is something we're going to see most places. Again, because the energy security is a requirement, not optional. You live in a modern economy, you want power to be there. There's going to be a need for industrial-sized batteries as well. Not necessarily in the car that I drive. That's not a great use for it. But making sure the grid has additional power and reserves in case the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine, that's going to be important unless you want to live in a world of load shedding and demand curtailment. Most people in modern society want there to be power when they turn on a light, want there to be air conditioning or heat when they need it. These are normal, basic necessities. That means you're going to be using a lot more nat gas, which does have 50% the CO2 emission of coal, and that's a big selling point. You see a lot more natty moving forward. There are a couple other key forecasts from the latest EIA annual energy outlook I want to share. Energy consumption overall in the U.S., right? One of the biggest consumers, expected to increase by 2050 with a lot more power gen. And the power gen is going to be more renewables, more natty, less coal. 2030, energy-related CO2 is expected to fall 25 to 38% below 2005 levels. That's not a lot lower than it is now, though. And remember that line going out that was kind of flat? It's not expected to go down much after that based on the current technologies available. Solar and wind are expected to generate a majority of power by 2050. In Texas, that'll probably be 10 or even 20 years sooner. And intermittent renewables require more curtailment and battery storage. In other words, you run risk of brownouts and load shedding, and you're going to need industrial battery storage to make sure that the grid has power that can be dispatched even when renewables aren't there, right? Sun doesn't shine at night. What happens if you have demand at night? What happens when there have been times when the New England ISO, lots of renewables, sun didn't shine, wind didn't blow, and they end up paying infinitely high prices for energy. If you want to keep the energy trilemma in balance, make sure you have secure supply and it's affordable and it's sustainable and more natty. There are also a couple other limitations I want to point out around the sustainability issues, and it really came up last year. The New Climate Institute and Carbon Market Watch did an analysis that Bloomberg reported on of the 25 biggest companies in the world. And they said, what are your sustainability plans? 25 biggest companies in the world. 13 said natural offsets. Allow me to clarify, planting trees. The other 12 were a mix of no published details and certain about offsets and claims without a neutralization justification. In other words, 13 were planting trees, 12 were a mix of no comment and no idea. So there's a huge reliance and an expectation that the new technologies are going to get us there. Maybe it's green hydrogen, maybe it's something else. It's honestly probably going to be a mix of a lot of different energy solutions, right? You see more electrification, you're going to see more CCGTs, you're going to see less coal, you're going to see hydrogen, you're going to see other solutions as well, including carbon capture and sequestration. There's a lot of hope around this. There needs to be a lot more research and work done around it. Blue hydrogen you can get to by still burning coal or natty, but you must sequester the emissions, right? Kinder Morgan's been pumping around CO2 emissions and doing sequestration for years, right? They've been using their pipelines for it. You're going to see a lot more of this going forward. Depleted oil and gas wells, filling them up with CO2. You're going to see a lot more of this going forward. But that's just one of the many solutions going forward. So, summary, a few things. Future of energy takeaways, and then we'll kind of wrap on the economic stuff, and then we've got some time for Q&A. Big thing that I talk to companies about when this comes up is sustainability is hard. Right? It's not easy. There's upfront costs. There is a regulatory mandate, an investment mandate, government mandate, SEC mandates. There's a lot of pressure on this subject, and that will increase. But oil and fuels demand will not disappear. There's still nothing as efficient and portable as liquid hydrocarbons, especially for personal vehicles that have 3% utilization rates. You're going to continue to see a lot of that. Cold War II threatens broader electrification. More mining will be required to hit those electrification numbers. By the way, that's all something that is not without an environmental footprint, right? You're going to need a lot more mining. That's a lot. And there's not going to be just one solution to get there. But oil is going to be part of the picture for many, many decades, most of this century, if not longer. And that gas will be probably a permanent fixture for this century and well beyond. Now, I'm classically trained as an economist, so I want to make sure I give a few economic thoughts around winning strategies for uncertainty. And that really starts with me talking about two curves. Y'all know about economics, right? Y'all know what these two curves are? Y'all know? Nobody? Supply and demand, oh, come on. Y'all know it's fear and greed, right? That's what's going to continue to drive markets. And right now, there's a lot of markets that are scared, but there's also a lot of opportunity. As you think about facing the near-term economic challenges, I would encourage you to do so head on. Continue to focus on return on investment, try to minimize costs where possible, account for sticky inflation, right? Because even though it's come down, some measures of inflation look like they've plateaued. And the agreements that you write, the terms that you set, maybe you want to account for sticky inflation, just in case. You want to be cautious with speculative investments. You want to prepare for a protracted Cold War II. Everyone wanted it to be over quickly, thought it'd be over quickly, not over quickly. Right? If ifs and buts and candy, if ifs and buts were candy and nuts, every day be Christmas, right? But it looks more likely you have an unstoppable force and an immovable object. And if that worsens, especially those tensions between the U.S. and China, you're going to see supply chains become bifurcated, especially for dual-use technologies. Any of the high-tech stuff you use, you buy, you contract for, be prepared that you might need to choose where they come from. Focus on operational resilience and cash flow, always a good idea, and assess options to reduce or offset risks. With that, I share my disclaimer. I know you're all reading it diligently. Everything could be wrong. And there's my contact info. And with that, I'd love to open it up for Q&A. We can talk about whatever you want. So thank you very much.